yes, let's keep the great presidents poll, but let's have some sort of measure of consequential presidents rather than great presidents. Because great presidents, to be a great president, you got to be a hero, right? There's just going to be a handful of people who ever end up in that category. But if you had a poll of consequential presidents, Wilson would always be there.
Patricia O'Toole is the author of acclaimed biographies of Theodore Roosevelt, When Trumpets Call, and Henry Adams, The Five of Hearts. She is the author of The Moralist, Woodrow Wilson, and the World He Made. And she joins me on the program. Patricia, thanks for coming on today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you will, bear with me while I relay a thought that I had. And I'm picturing Woodrow Wilson's statue, say, in Princeton, and a group of protesters, perhaps as students, taking a hammer to it because perhaps they don't like his racial views, and then passing the hammer on to a conservative who doesn't like him for, say, enlarging the income tax or enlarging the size of government, and then passing on the hammer to a libertarian who doesn't like what he might have done with restrictive policies around World War I. And then passing the hammer to an anti-globalist who doesn't like his attitudes about America's place in the world. The list could go on and on. It seems like there's some strange bedfellows in people who perhaps these days don't like Woodrow Wilson very much.
That's a wonderful image of all these people from different political persuasions hacking down a statue, having many reasons to do that. One of the things I discovered early on about Woodrow Wilson that intrigued me was I was reading a number of books about presidential greatness, and I started with the Index. And there was one by a wonderful historian named Thomas Bailey, and in the Index, Wilson occupies more space than any other president, more than FDR, more than Lincoln, more than Washington. And I thought, that really caught my attention. I thought, what is that all about? And as I read into what people at the time and later thought about Wilson, he's both a really controversial president and a really consequential president. So his admirers think, okay, there are all these criticisms you could make of him, and they're not trying to say that the criticisms are unjustified. But in the end, he did something. He did things both in domestic policy and foreign policy that were really, really important. And you don't have to admire him, but you have to acknowledge that they were consequential and permanent in changing the way the world thinks about things. So on the domestic side, there's the New Freedom package of economic reform legislation that he passed very quickly. So he establishes the Federal Reserve. He gets a new antitrust law that makes it easier to nip monopoly in the bud, gets a Federal Trade Commission, and the modern income tax, which replaced the old protectionist tax, which had tariffs on so many goods coming into the country. And it was actually, if you wanted to make America great again, we could go back to that income tax because the top bracket was 7%. And the only people who had to pay 7% were those who earned over $500,000 a year in 1916. So half the country paid no income tax, and then it was scaled up very gradually.
I mean, I suppose then it was just a way of financing a lower tariff. If we're going to reduce tariffs, there had to still be a way to fund the government.
Yeah, that was it. And the Democrats, the Republicans argued about this, but the Democrats' analysis of the tariff was that it helped protect American industry. So those who owned shares in American companies got rich, and those who were customers, which would be just about everybody in the country, actually paid more for their products than they would have without this tariff. So it was a way of redistributing the tax burden. Tax had to be paid in one way or another. It's a question of whether you're going to have a tariff or have an income tax.
Your thesis is that Woodrow Wilson, perhaps more than any president, injected moral force into his decision-making and his style of his presidency. I wish you would talk a bit about the book's thesis.
Yes, I wanted what I thought was the defining trait of Woodrow Wilson as the center of the book. And one reason I wanted that is if you don't have that, then he's involved in so many different things, some of his own making and some just by virtue of when he was president, during being commander-in-chief in World War I and then being one of the great powers who negotiated the peace afterwards. So I just kept thinking for a long time about what is it that's at the heart of Woodrow Wilson that I can hang kind of just about everything on. And his moral concern was very deep. He was an extremely principled man. And previous biographers have, when they've written about this, I wasn't the first person to notice that he was a deeply principled man. But previous biographers had kind of attributed this to the fact that he was the son of a Presbyterian preacher, and there were many Presbyterian preachers in the family tree. So, they put it on his growing up in that kind of background and taking Judeo-Christian values with him into politics. And I don't think that's wrong, but he was not a leader who governed from his religion. He never claimed to know the will of God. He wasn't a zealot. He did not try to impose his religion in his politics. And when God turns up in his speeches, it was the way it kind of turns up later with, God bless America kind of thing, or God willing, we will prevail, or that. It's very generic. So my idea was that he came to the White House from having studied, basically starting when he was a teenager, studying history and politics and government and being really serious about it. And he had a faith in democracy that I would say compared, is equal to his faith in God. So he believes that democracy is the most moral form of government because it rests on the consent of the governed. He believes that because the United States at that point is the world's most successful democracy, that the United States is a morally superior. And he believes that when the war comes along, he believes that we have a mission to take this wonderful democracy to the rest of the world, not impose it on them, but where other people wanted to form democratic governments, do what we could to help them thrive. Probably he wouldn't thought of it as nation building, but being a support for democratic government, helping them in various ways, probably not with foreign aid. That, as I don't recall that ever came up, but just being there to support them. And a lot of 9 new democracies were created at the end of World War I, mostly on the ruins of the Habsburg Empire, and they were fragile states. So it was his idea that the United States would be better off and the world would be better off if we helped them succeed.
And these were, I think, ideals that were saluted with presidents of the past and the problems that America had with civil service reform and corruption in government and bossism and all kinds of things like that. There was Woodrow Wilson coming out of New Jersey with what he had accomplished and taking on the bosses there, really seemed like a fine choice. These were assets, a moral president. Now maybe we recoil a bit at the introduction of morality in our presidents and politicians. It's almost like, well, who are you to tell me? I guess moral force can be dangerous too. I mean, a king or a strongman might assert moral force.
Yes, you can always find a moral justification for doing what you're doing. The slaveholders, when slavery came under attack, found all kinds of passages in the Bible that they claimed supported slavery. So that is a danger. With Wilson, he really was, I think, admirable in terms of his moral convictions. And he in the first 6 years of his presidency, and when he went to Congress, he's the first president since John Adams to address the Congress in person. He did it maybe 24 times. And the speeches all have the same kind of pattern. he comes and he says, we need to do X because it's the right thing to do, and it will have these material benefits to all the people of the United States. So that's his thing, that we want to do the right thing, and it's going to turn out to be the practical thing as well. So that you can kind of get on board with. I mean, if the person makes a good case, you think, yes, we should do that. But what happened to him in 1918, at that point he's been president for 6 years, and it comes midterm election time, and he's had majorities in both the House and the Senate for 6 years. So he's gotten a lot of things done. But coming up on those midterm elections, he, against all advice, sent out a bulletin to the American people saying, you really need to vote Democratic this time because at the end of the war, I'm going to have to go abroad to negotiate the peace, and it's going to be really complicated, and I will do better if I can go there, and the world knows that I have the force of the American people behind me. Well, the Republicans were insulted by this because they had been much better across the board in supporting all his war measures than the Democrats had been across the board. So they felt that as a real slap in the face. And the control of Congress changes in that election. Both the House and both the Senate are now in Republican hands. And Wilson doesn't change. I mean, that would be a moment to course correct, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But he doesn't change. He gets the kind of moral conviction sort of bleeds into moral superiority and moral vanity. And so then in the debates that followed about the League of Nations, which was part of the Treaty of Versailles, the Covenant of the League of Nations was part of the treaty, when the Republicans disagreed with him, he said that their idea was not as morally superior as his, and that's just what you were talking about. It's really irritating to hear from someone that just because you have a different opinion, your notion is morally inferior.
We've looked at a lot of historic midterms on this program. There's no more dangerous words for a president to utter than "give me a Congress." He did that. He made that mistake. Several others, from Clinton and Obama to FDR in '38. It just seems like presidents don't get on the high horse and tell Americans just because you were elected that you can tell them how to vote in other elections.
Yes.
Was there middle ground? You hear that there were people that were the irreconcilables, that maybe were never going to agree to a league. I mean, did he have a play there? If he had acted better, do you think he could have got a lead?
Yes. The Republicans, there were different factions of the Republicans, some who favored the league pretty much as it was, and then some real hardcore people who said, we're not going to vote for this under any circumstances. And the reason was they thought it would involve the United States in all kinds of things abroad that were not tied to U.S. interests. And then there were some moderates, and so there was a spectrum of Republican opinion, and they kind of coalesced everything into 14 reservations that they wanted attached to the treaty, just places where the United States was going to differ from what the rest of the world who was signing this treaty did. And reservations come up in treaties all the time. And Wilson would not compromise. He had compromised in the negotiations in Paris. He had to, because there were basically, in most instances, four powers, including the United States, making the decisions, and they had decided that all of their votes had to be unanimous. Otherwise, Germany would exploit the division of opinion. So he would get outvoted on a lot of things. And so he comes home having compromised, and he just wants the Senate to fully stand behind him. And he thinks his ace in the hole, really, is that the Senate has never failed to ratify a peace treaty. So he thinks, okay, they're going to fuss this way and that way and the other way, but in the end, they will vote for the treaty. So he took an enormous gamble. And he had a big stroke in the middle of this fight. So he gets sidelined, and it's the ranking Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee who is leading the fight for him. And he really, really did try. And at some point, Britain and France were appalled by the idea that the Senate might not ratify the treaty, and they got word to Washington, some of it in public and some of it through diplomatic channels. We can live with these Republican reservations, just let's get the treaty and have the United States in the treaty. But Wilson, by this time, he's very compromised by the stroke, and some people think he was more stubborn than ever after the stroke. But before that, he had been very stubborn as well. He just was not going to give. So I don't, if he had compromised, yes, the treaty would have been ratified and the United States would have joined the League of Nations, which would have been a good thing. Nothing I've read has convinced me that that would have prevented World War II, but it would have been a good thing for the United States to be at the center of the League for all those years. It turned out to be ineffectual because there wasn't any will to enforce the provisions of the treaty once Hitler and Mussolini started misbehaving.
Of course, we weren't members either.
Right. Yes.
I watched a movie from the 1940s, the biopic on Wilson.
Wilson, yes.
And it is interesting to watch that narrative, because that narrative is very much that. Here was this prescient man. Here was this man who was so ahead of his time, and the fools like Lodge and Bora, and how could we have gone down that road and entered isolation, and look at, with the hindsight of World War II, and look at what it wrought when we didn't listen to Wilson. And it's just interesting to see that narrative, because it's a very different take from the way a lot of people have it now. That was the kind of heroic Wilson.
Yes. And the tragic Wilson, and, tragedy for Wilson, tragedy for the world narrative.
He was also one of the first presidents really to take a message on the road like that. I mean, TR made a lot of stumps, but as president, trying to think if it was anything of that type, and to really take a message on the road. And had he not had the stroke after the Colorado speech, I do wonder if he would have been able to turn opinion.
Well, he was not in good shape when he went on that speaking tour. He had a brilliantly successful speaking tour in 1916, where he basically talked a country that didn't want anything to. I say in the book, when it came to foreign relations, Americans didn't want any. Before World War I, they were happy in their splendid isolation. So he saw that the United States would be very vulnerable if it didn't build up its army and its navy. This was a very unpopular idea, except in the northeastern United States, where there were a lot of hawks. So he took this message on the road, and he actually changed opinion. So in 1919, when he comes home and the treaty is under siege in the Senate, he does the same thing and hoping for the same results. But he was really exhausted when he went on that tour. And he didn't, when he went on the 1916 tour, he asked the people to be in touch with their senators and congressmen about this, and they were. And this time around, he didn't even really ask. I mean, it's like he didn't think of it. And his speeches, there are beautiful lines in them, but they're really kind of rambling. And also, the Republicans sent out speakers behind him. They'd be like maybe 3 days behind him, and they'd come to town and say, don't pay attention to that. It'd be better if we just stayed with our old pre-war idea. What Wilson is suggesting might be noble, but it's never been tried before. Why should we take that risk? And I was interested to find that people were not writing the Senate and please pass the Treaty of Versailles. There's very little mail coming into the Senate about that.
Okay, that's very interesting to know. A reminder that I am speaking with Patricia O'Toole, the author of The Moralist, Woodrow Wilson and the World He Made. Let's talk about race. We have to with Wilson in these modern times. There are a number of people that listen to my program. I put up a post once and said asked a question about Woodrow Wilson, and someone just the first comment, I don't care, he's a racist.
Mm-hmm.
The one fact to hold on to, often you hear about, is the federal government being segregated under Woodrow Wilson's time in office. It's hard to dispute. It could be nuanced a bit, and I know in your book you do. I mean, to what extent is the segregation of the civil service Wilson's, or is it really Burleson and the other Southerners in his cabinet? They kind of pushed him into it, or some combination?
Well, it's really important to understand what happened, not to excuse it. It's really inexcusable. It deserves the condemnation that it has had. But what started with Wilson, one of the reasons that the racism was so terrible is that it lasted for a really long time. And it affected, for example, New Deal legislation, when, the context is this. To get anything passed in the House and the Senate, you need Southern votes. And sometimes, like in the case of the economic reforms that Wilson passed, the Southerners were very quick to see that that was a huge expansion of federal authority. And if you're a Southerner, you're relying on states' rights. You don't really like expansion of federal authority. And it's very easy to jump from, well, if they're going to expand their authority in this realm, before you know it, they're going to be banning segregation and, all the state laws that we have to keep blacks in their place is how they would have thought about it. So Wilson had two handlers in Congress. One was his Secretary of the Treasury, a guy named McAdoo, and the other one was the Postmaster General, Burleson. And they, in their negotiations with the House and the Senate, the Southerners wanted something in return for their votes for supporting these economic reforms. They wanted a concrete sign from Wilson that he was not going to touch anything to do with their segregationist laws in the South, the state laws. So what they asked for was segregation of the civil service. And Wilson was in a bind. He thought that these economic reforms that he was passing were going to be really good for the country. They were, and they did end the days of laissez-faire and the plutocrats. I mean, that was over with these changes. But he agreed to this bargain, and the way I talk about it, I say, here's a moral man agreeing. He gets these moral victories, and he thought of this legislation as these legislative acts as moral victories. But he gets them in an immoral bargain because he agrees to segregation.
What kind of legislation, when you talk about ending the plutocrats, are we talking about the Federal Reserve Bill? Are we talking about 8-hour workday or child labor?
Yeah, we're talking about the Fed and the new Antitrust Act, which, the Fed gives many more people access to credit than ever had it before. The new Antitrust Act and the Federal Trade Commission make competition fairer than it's ever been before. So, the big guys can't crush the small guys with the ease that they had been able to in the past. And the modern income tax, replacing that tariff revenue with income tax revenue, most people, half the people didn't pay any income tax, but now their consumer goods that happened to be made abroad were much cheaper than they had been before. So they were saving, it was estimated that the average family saved like $1,000 a year with that change. So those were good kind of like common man measures. One thing that was very interesting to me, of course, black leaders were very upset by this because a lot of them felt they'd always voted the party of Lincoln pretty much. And they felt after doing that for decades, they hadn't gotten anything. So they were willing to take a chance on Wilson. And he said to one group that he promised them equal justice. And he said something like, and not mere grudging justice, but kind of wholehearted justice. So here he is, a few months into his presidency, segregating the civil service. So they're very upset, as are northern white liberals who had supported Wilson, people who were busy helping found the NAACP, helping work for economic opportunity for all and for racial equality in other ways. They're very upset. So Wilson would, from time to time, have one of these groups or one of these leaders in his office for a discussion of this. And at least twice after these, he was so upset that he had to take to his bed. He was somebody who if there was too much stress, he often got sick, and the White House would put out a bulletin saying the president has a cold and will be staying in the family quarters of the White House. And but it was kind of monumental digestive upsets that he had. And I think this is a man who loves to have the moral high ground. And I think that deep down, he knew he didn't have it on this issue, but he couldn't think what to do. He couldn't think how to reconcile the morality and the immorality in this.
Well, I think it's important to contextualize the politics of the time between the two parties. The Republicans had no support in the South and therefore had a kind of political free shot on goal to do anything they wanted there. But the Democrat running relied on Southern votes. The one thing that is obvious, or really makes a statement, is that there were very few or none African American appointees in the North when the Republicans were in power. It's just that they took the area where they had no real chance of winning, and therefore no one to anger, and took this kind of brave stand. And so Wilson gets in, needs votes, as you say, to pass the legislation. It's an ugly trade. It is a little nuanced, too, because I think a lot of people say, well, Wilson segregated the government. And yes, I mean, suppose if you talk about the Postal Service, it's the large organ with a lot of the jobs. But again, some of this is just merely the spoils system. The new party is coming in, and they're...
Yeah, in terms of appointments, it definitely is the spoils system. But in terms of people who just applied to be clerks in the civil service, that had or to work in the post office, and just happenstance really. The two largest bureaucracies at that time are the post office. So there's Postmaster Burleson making this deal. He's a Southerner, and the Treasury Department. And there's McAdoo, who is also a Southerner by birth, making this deal with Southerners in the Senate. So nobody is, be interesting to think about what might have happened if those two guys had been Northerners instead of Southerners, or if they had represented the Department of the Interior and, the Department of Labor, which at that point was a small department. It was actually brand new. So they're Southerners, and they're in the cabinet, and they're in charge of these really large bureaucracies. And those civil service jobs, both working for the post office and working in other parts of the civil service, that for decades had been a way for blacks in Washington to move into the middle class. And all of a sudden, there's segregation, and the first segregation, it was just very mean-spirited. It's like, well, you can't eat in our lunchroom anymore, or you're going to have to go to restrooms that are way down the basement and on the far side of this giant building. But then very shortly after that, they start requiring photographs when you apply for a job in the civil service. So all of a sudden, African Americans aren't getting jobs. And it just goes on from there. And the other thing to remember is that this starts with Wilson, but it doesn't end with Wilson when Wilson leaves office and Harding, a Republican, becomes president. It goes on like way into the New Deal. So you have both Republicans and Democrats in the White House who are not changing this backward step that the Wilson administration changed. And one more point about race that doesn't get discussed enough, in my view, is it wasn't just African Americans where Wilson's bigotry comes out. He felt that way about the Japanese. There are a couple of incidents in the book that have to do with that. And he felt that way about, there are all these military interventions that he makes in the Caribbean. And, he's never intervening against a government that's run by whites. It's always brown people who are under attack. And the justification, not justification for it, but the kind of explanation is that the Panama Canal is new, and the United States really needs to tamp down any instability in the region, it feels, so every time there's a revolution or a new band of bandits takes over from the old band of bandits. The Marines are landing and.
Oh, I mean, Mexico is under rebellion, and I have no doubt that if it happened in 2018 or even, I know that Mexico is in a bad situation now with cartels and things, but if it was just a no government whatsoever now, I'm sure that we'd be intervening in some way. I mean, instability on the border. No, it's an interesting point that you bring up. It's very hard for a modern audience, and I suppose it should be. And I suppose he does deserve criticism, and in modern eyes can never be that great, because for us, race is so important that we have to get beyond,
right.
And we have to get, and it's just unacceptable. It is, of course, important to look at him as in a larger sense, look at how important he is. The slogan when he got reelected was "He kept us out of war." And I've always wondered about taking that literally. I know he didn't like the slogan, but he did keep us out of World War I for some period when some Americans, like Theodore Roosevelt, others, may have wanted us to jump in at a time that might have been very bad. I mean, should he get a little more credit for at least keeping us out a few years?
Yes, and there's some thought, too, that the war he had kept us out of was Mexico, because we had a couple of interventions in Mexico, but there was never really officially a war with Mexico. And Wilson, those interventions did not go well, and he learned from them. When the Russian Revolution came along and there was a lot of pressure from abroad to intervene, he ultimately did in a very tiny way, but by then his thought was, when a country's having a revolution, you should let them figure it out themselves, even though these are his words, even though they wallow in anarchy for a while. So he did learn that it had not been a good idea to intervene in the Mexican Revolution. The other thing is that, we talk about great presidents, and every year there are these polls of great presidents in all these different categories. And I read them with great interest, but it occurred to me, looking at last year's CNN poll, Wilson dropped from number 6 to number 10, and I think that's for two reasons. One is there's been the racism stuff was never like a secret. It seemed it when it came out, when the students started protesting at Princeton, but it was, it was in the history books and it wasn't part of the popular consciousness. But I was thinking that instead of yes, let's keep the great presidents poll, but let's have some sort of measure of consequential presidents rather than great presidents. Because great presidents, to be a great president, you got to be a hero, right? So we're only there's just going to be a handful of people who ever end up in that category. But if you had a poll of consequential presidents, Wilson would always be there with Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And maybe, I don't know who you would add to that list of a later president, but maybe George W. Bush, because that was a huge change for us, and we're still reaping the whirlwind on that one.
And to the extent that a liberal turns against Wilsonianism, I think it's coming from that place. It's coming from the Bush administration, second Bush administration, and the kind of neocons, if you will, and the ideas, grand designs for American, presence in the Middle East, that it would be wrong to assign blame to Wilson. It's so far in the past, but his idea that America has this moral place and must act because it can. And we're looking at that, I think, with a harsh eye, and almost Republicans and Democrats. I think it's hard to gauge Trump on anything, but to an extent, at least when he was running, there was a little bit of criticism of some of that Bush interventionism.
Yes, well, certainly later presidents. Interesting, FDR is a committed internationalist, but he, when you were talking about the Wilson movie that came out in 1944, and, that was really a pitch for creating another international organization, which the Roosevelt administration already had underway. I mean, they're busy planning the UN from shortly after the time the United States enters World War II. And some historians think that FDR, who had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy throughout Wilson's presidency and watched him up close and very carefully throughout. Some people think that FDR completely threw out what Wilson had done. And I think of it more as what FDR was doing was Wilson 2.0. He was trying to figure out how to save what had been admirable about the League of Nations, basically the idea that the world would be better off if there's a global organization of governments who come together to cooperate on things and particularly to try to keep peace in the world. And that was a revolutionary idea that Wilson had, because before that, there wasn't a global organization of governments. It would just be these alliances of great powers, and that exploded in World War I when, one member of one alliance goes to war, then the other members of that alliance have to do it, and so you very quickly had the whole world at war in a couple of weeks because I can't remember how many nations altogether were involved in the two big alliances, but maybe 16, something like that. And that's those days, that's a lot of nations. That was a very big idea, and in a way, it's been the touchstone of our foreign policy debates ever since. So you have a president like Nixon, for example, who's nobody has better anti-communist credentials than Richard Nixon when he comes to office. But his mother admired Woodrow Wilson. The family's Quaker, so the idea of a peaceful world means something to Nixon. But he thought that the way he read what Wilson had tried to do is like overcommitment of the United States. FDR, one mistake that he avoided was Wilson had never built bipartisan support for the League. He was just determined to ignore the Republicans and barrel the thing through on his own. And so from the beginning, FDR is building support. And FDR and his advisors also concluded that one of the reasons the League had failed is that it took on too many things. It was trying to accomplish too many things. So the UN is set up to do some things, but then there are these other organizations that are created at about the same time to take care of more, to just shift some of the responsibilities away from the UN to other international organizations, some of which were regional, like NATO, and some of which were global, like the IMF and the World Bank. So it's a different model, but a lot of the language, I was interested to see this, a lot of the language in the UN Charter is lifted straight from the League of Nations covenant in terms of its aspirations for the world and the great ideal that it's putting out there of all the nations of the world coming together to preserve peace.
Yeah, I think globalism's under attack, but my opinion of it is I think it's a little bit of taking for granted all the benefits. You on the tariff issue, you talked earlier about the prices coming down, and we're certainly just taking that for granted now, and even thinking about bringing tariffs back to a greater extent. With globalism, we tire of the UN and all the countries yelling at America or things like that, but forget of all the good things that it can do.
Yeah. Wilson understood that he wasn't actually the first president to understand that with modern communication in the world, information being able to travel very quickly, danger can travel very quickly. So he wanted a way, for the world to be able to come together to meet aggression. Democracy, his big line from his speech when he asked Congress for a declaration of war is the world must be made safe for democracy. And, we could look at that 100 years later and basically say, yeah, we have to do that. I mean, if you care about democracy, it seems a high priority. And yet democracy is under attack. In many countries around the world, we have the rise of these strongman dictators in Hungary and Poland, Turkey, the Philippines, and elsewhere. And we also have, incursions on civil liberties that we take for granted. Lots of attacks on the press. We're beginning to see that here.
On that note, should he have clamped down more in his own administration? Some of the attorney generals who were perhaps doing that in the United States, clamping down on dissent?
Absolutely. That is the World War I era of repressing dissent is the worst in our history. 1,500 people went to jail for disagreeing with the U.S. Decision to enter the war. There's never been anything like it, and the laws that were passed that made that possible are actually still on the books. So,
was it that he was afraid? I guess it's just, he, as
a young man, he didn't like immigrants from countries other than the Northern European countries. But he, I think somebody got hold of him fairly early and said, these people vote. You can't just write them off. So he changed his tune on that in a really quite wonderful way. There's a speech he gave to a group of people who were they were just taking their going through their citizenship ceremony. And he said, we need you. We need immigrants because you've now just been taught all of our ideals. They're very fresh in your mind. And you're going to go out in the world and you're going to find that our behavior is somewhat below those ideals. So we need you to remind us of those ideals, which I think is just a terrific civic idea. And he really meant it. So when World War I comes along, what he's afraid of, it's like about a third of the country at that point are either immigrants or children of immigrants. And they have family members, relatives in the old country fighting on both sides. So he's worried that the divisions of Europe are going to be played out among competing ethnic groups. Austrian immigrants are all of a sudden going to be angry with French immigrants and British immigrants, and so that's his big worry. But it got really way out of hand, and from time to time, when his attorney general or the postmaster general clamped down on dissent, he would write a letter and say, really, I think this is over the top. I think we can, okay, these sentiments are not really admirable, but I think we can have room for this kind of dissent. And back would come some reply saying, actually, Mr. President, there's terrible stuff going on out there, and we can't. We have to unify the people. And then he never pursued it. He was kind of good for one round, and that was it. I mean, once he got a reply back, that was kind of it. He didn't put up a fight about it.
You had referenced the Committee for Public Information and 150,000 volunteers to spread the propaganda and the messages, and perhaps to eyes and ears to also report bad things and all of this. But it's kind of a pre-technology way of doing propaganda. It just reminds me of when we hear about the taking information from cell phones at the NSA and things like that, how similar in a kind of eyes and ears fashion.
Yes, there was the eyes and ears thing, kind of volunteers, sort of volunteer FBI agents, if you will. I mean, and there was one organization in particular that gave out badges that looked very like Secret Service badges. So that's not good. Somebody can come in with a badge and it kind of sounds like the Secret Service. They were skulking around doing all kinds of things, invading privacy in all kinds of ways. But the other part of the effort that really interested to me, there's it's called the Committee on Public Information, and it's really like the Ministry of Propaganda. And their basic tactic was to monopolize the news. So the government, all government announcements, virtually all of them, came out now through the Committee on Public Information. And they didn't see this as propaganda. They saw it as informing the public. And a lot of it really was kind of straightforward information, or else information in a sort of cheerleading variety, boy, our troops, they're the most terrific guys because of this, that, and the other thing. So there's that kind of stuff that's sort of benign, and there wasn't really an effort to put out false information that's maybe a little sunny at times, but there came to be a really dark side to this about hating the Hun, and there are posters for, they wanted people to buy Liberty bonds to fund the war, and they have these German soldiers portrayed not as humans, but as beasts. They look very ape-like. They're making movies with titles. There's one about the Kaiser, and they call him the Beast of Berlin. There's another one called the Prussian Cur. And, that's really animalizing the enemy. And the effort was, the guy who ran the Committee on Public Information, George Creel, he said he wanted to weld the people into a white-hot mass of war will. So, yeah. And maybe that's something that might be okay to do with soldiers you're sending into battle, but you don't really want every citizen feeling that way. Because there were, in addition to the prosecution of dissent that the government was doing, there are all these vigilantes that turn up. Some guy sitting in a bar maybe says, "Oh, I don't know about this war," and then you have these overzealous patriots who are dragging him out into the street, beating him up, spitting on him, making him kiss the flag. That was a big thing, to make people kiss the flag, and there was a lot of that. That's the dark side. Yeah.
History never repeats itself, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, did you come out of it liking Woodrow Wilson? You spent a lot of time with him. Did you come out liking Woodrow Wilson?
My previous book was about Theodore Roosevelt, and every single day it was great to work on that book. And I often dreamed about him. With Wilson, it took twice as long. I never dreamed about him, not once. And I came out admiring his hopes and dreams for the world. We still have to find a way to have peace in the world, and that's a pretty big dream. There aren't many statesmen who have dreams that big, so I can admire that. But mostly, I feel sorry for him because he was the greatest speaker of his time, and he used oratory very well, but he wasn't good at human relations. He never cultivated other politicians. Theodore Roosevelt, if you had been in his office at 11:30 in the morning, and let's say, he's a Republican, let's say you're a Democrat, and you came to talk to him about some kind of friction between the parties, you'd have your conversation, and then he would look at his watch and say, it's lunchtime. Can you come up and have lunch with Mrs. Roosevelt and the children and me? Quentin was asking me about your dog just the other day. So this would be so cool. You'd go have lunch with the Roosevelts. You'd go back to the Hill, and you'd think, you know what? I don't always agree with that guy, but I'm going to support him when I can, just because he's such a nice guy and he showed that he cared about you. Wilson could not bring himself to do that, he thinks he can govern by having great ideas and selling the ideas. He doesn't like negotiation. He doesn't like compromise. And he is kind of a partisan president, not because he really hates Republicans, but because he thinks that you govern through parties. So what the president has to do is really pay attention to his party. So he wants good, big things for the country and the world. So you have to admire that. But then he just doesn't develop. I don't think anybody is born with all the skills it takes to be a good president. But
No.
he doesn't work to develop the ones where he has some weakness. He just thinks he can do it all on oratory and great ideas. And to me, that's tragic.
And we've been speaking with Patricia O'Toole, the author of The Moralist, Woodrow Wilson, and The World He Made, highly recommended. Patricia, thanks for coming on My History Could Beat Up Your Politics.
Thanks, Bruce. It was a wonderful conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
And our thanks to Patricia O'Toole for coming on My History Could Beat Up Your Politics. A reminder about the Premium Podcast. We have a special episode on the Lusitania sinking on there at www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com. Thanks for listening.